am so excited to be here with Samin Nosrat, the author of the new book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which is sort of a life mantra more than just a book title.
Manifesto.
So first of all, you believe that anyone can learn how to cook if they understand these 4 ingredients.
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, it was sort of how it happened for me. I dropped into sort of this situation where I was all of a sudden in this amazing restaurant, Chez Panisse in Berkeley, and all of the cooks, every day the menu was changing, and no matter what we were cooking, everybody knew how to make everything without a recipe, and they would just get up and go into the kitchen, no cookbooks, no recipes, and make everything. And so over the course of probably a year, I started to see these patterns. No matter what we were making, the 4 elements we were always paying attention to were salt, fat, acid, and heat. And so once I sort of got a handle on a few basic things about each thing, then I was no longer afraid to go to the farmer's market and buy some vegetables, or go to a friend's house and just cook with what they had. And it started to become my compass that guided me through any kitchen.
We start cooking with cookbooks, and every cookbook sort of assumes that you know basics. People will say, saute this on medium-high heat. And you're like, well, what is medium-high heat? What is saute? How long? Oh, my thing doesn't look like that after 5 minutes. Was it important to you to kind of say, because the first half of your book is not recipes, it's a guide. And so was that important to kind of say, the recipe is one thing, but the technique is another?
Absolutely. And I think, it's hard. I think if you have some basic knowledge, that then you can find your way through any recipe. I think people, the minute they open a book to a recipe, what they'll do is they'll just sort of surrender all of their own instincts and good judgment and say, well, the recipe told me 5 minutes, but even though it's not brown, I'm just gonna trust that and do what the recipe said. The recipe said only 3 tomatoes, but my tomatoes are small. I wanted to help people develop their own instincts so that they could use their own judgment as they cook with recipes, and then maybe eventually graduate to a place where they don't need them.
And then let's talk about, some of these 4 basics, because I think that for a lot of people, when you say, salt is a great example. For a lot of people, salt is a singular thing. It does a simple thing. And in fact, there are many types of salt. There are many purposes for salts. There's salting before and there's salting after. What are the mistakes that you see people making all the time that you kind of want the public to understand?
A lot of people sort of, think of salt as something that's in the shaker that sits on the table that you just sort of shake onto your food at the last minute. And I would encourage people to start salting their food earlier in the cooking process, tasting it more often, and adjusting the seasoning as they go. Because to me, getting the food seasoned from within, getting the salt all the way inside, which sometimes involves you maybe salting a piece of meat the night before, and sometimes it's just like putting the salt in with the beans and the water right when you set it on the stove. So getting the salt in there earlier is, I think, going to change the way your food tastes.
What's hard for a lot of people is to say to themselves, well, I see salt as an add-on, whereas you sort of make the argument that salt is an enhancer, it's not an addition.
Yes, yeah, that's one of I did a lot of funny little science homework throughout this process.
There's a lot of science in this book for anyone who likes science as much as I do.
And so, and one of the things I really found out, and it made so much sense to me, is that that's salt's main role in our food is to enhance flavors. And it actually makes the flavors that humans love more powerful, and some of the flavors that are difficult for us, like sometimes bitterness, salt suppresses bitterness.
And as much as people sort of are afraid of salt, they're on some level even more afraid of fat.
Yes.
And I think that one of the things that you do so well in this book is say that, fat is, in unctuousness, it's not necessarily animal fat, which is what we think of. It's oils, it's creaminess. How do you approach fat as a concept when the word itself is so loaded?
Kind of the miracle of fat is that it makes available to us so many of the textures that we love. Humans are wired to enjoy, we derive pleasure from contrasts. So whether it's contrasts in texture or in flavor or in temperature, whether it's crispy breadcrumbs on top of creamy macaroni and cheese, or a crispy outside and a creamy inside of a grilled cheese sandwich or something. Those things make our mouths happy. And the way that we get those textures almost always involves fats. And so if you can just start to think of fat as a tool, people are so afraid of using oil in the pan that a lot of the times they don't put enough oil to coat the bottom of the pan. And then food, like if you put a steak or a piece of fish into a pan that doesn't have enough oil, it'll cook unevenly and get blistery and stick to the pan. Whereas if you just use enough oil to create a thin layer, you'll be able to, the oil can act as a medium and let the heat really reach the fish and create a nice crisp crust. And then you can lift the fish out and leave the oil behind. And it's not so much an ingredient as it was a tool for getting the texture that you wanted on the fish.
And with acidity, you kind of show it as like, I think everybody thinks like acidity is a certain thing of like squeeze a lemon on it, but it can actually come from a lot of different sources. What were some of the surprising acidic sources to you?
Well, for me, I love, once I started thinking about it, fermented foods are all acidic. And then there are all these things that are unexpected, or we just don't think of as fermented, like chocolate and coffee and tea. Those are all acidic things that can sort of bring a little tang. And actually, this is maybe the most surprising one, is that caramel, a dark caramel, is acidic, which is kind of why if you have like a scoop of vanilla ice cream and a scoop of caramel ice cream, even if they were made with the same amount of sugar, the caramel ice cream will taste less sweet because that sugar has been turned into acid.
And so heat, I think, for people would seem like the easiest part, but in many ways, it's the part that we have the least control over. I love your section about ovens because it's like, every oven is so terrible and is not actually accurate.
Totally.
And every stove is different. So when you're heating a pan, what you think is high heat on one pan is not. And you talk about sort of open flame cooking and how on some level that's easier. But how do people get control of something that in essence is not
seems uncontrollable? Yeah. I think for me a big sort of like a clicking aha light bulb moment was when I realized it wasn't so much about the source of heat. And there are some recipes I remember at the restaurant where I worked, we always did our braises in the oven there. And then someone said, you can just do that on the stove. You don't have to do the whole, it didn't even occur to me that I could just do it in a Dutch oven on the stove. And really all I was looking for were the same cues of bringing it up to a boil and turning it down to a simmer. And so it didn't matter if the heat was coming from below on a burner or from, all around in an oven. And same thing where eventually I learned, it doesn't matter what the source of heat is. It matters what's happening in the pan. So for example, if you're roasting carrots in the oven, it doesn't matter so much if the oven's at 400 or 425. What matters is the rate at which they're cooking. So is the outside browning at the same rate that the inside is becoming tender? Or is the outside browning and the inside staying raw because the oven's too hot?
The book is Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. It's really, to me, it's like, I think like the next generation, like Mark Bittman, how to cook everything sort of thing. So if you have a book where you need a go-to guide, this is really it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for letting me go.